When I was in high school, I had a teacher who I took his class freshman year. And for the 3 years after that, until I left high school, this teacher called me Eddie. Hey there, Eddie. Good to see you, Eddie. How you been? Doesn't matter how many times I corrected him. Does not matter how many times I told him, hey, actually, it's Jeff. Does not matter that I took his class and we interacted a lot. To this one teacher, I was Eddie. Eventually, I just had to accept that that was going to be the case for the entirety of my high school career. I'm not even really sure where he got the name Eddie from, but that was my name as far as this teacher was concerned. And the thing is, that detail, that one small thing was annoying enough that it has been 17 years since I graduated high school, and sometimes I still find myself thinking about it. Now, I want you to imagine yourself in that position. How would you feel? It's annoying, right? Now imagine if instead of a teacher, it was your doctor. Imagine how you would feel having to correct someone on something as basic as your name when that person is tasked with managing something as important as your health and wellness. Now imagine that instead of getting your name wrong, your doctor is forgetting that you're blind and that you need letters sent to you in Braille so that you can read them. Or failing to remember that you have someone legally tasked with overseeing your health decisions so that the person who takes care of you can make crucial decisions on your behalf, and your doctor consistently forgets that and fails to include them on communications. When you think about it in that context, you can very easily see how that experience goes from being an annoyance to something heartbreaking and even dangerous very, very quickly. And that right there is why being aware of patients' communication preferences is so crucial to managed care organizations, MCOs for short. So important, in fact, that new legislation went into effect in New York State on October 1st that made tracking these electronic communication preferences not just important, but mandatory for compliance. Now, obviously, this legislation is very important to understand if you are an MCO in New York, but even if you're from outside of the state, this is exactly the kind of thing that is worth paying extremely close attention to. Both because similar laws could be coming down the pipeline in your state, but also because it's the right thing to do. Payers and providers need to be tracking these sorts of preferences, whether or not it's mandatory for compliance, because it helps humanize the experience. And of course, the other reason why it's very important to pay attention to this, even if it's not a compliance issue yet, is because it takes a lot of work to get to that state of compliance once that regulation comes through. Payers deal with an enormous number of patients and an overwhelming amount of data, and going from faxed notes to readily, easily sharing that data, it's the kind of thing that you want to be putting into place before you have to. And for many payers and providers, it's a clear reason why they need effective digital tools to help manage that process. This is Transformation at Work, a podcast about real stories of business transformation and Salesforce success, without all the jargon attached. The show is brought to you by Gerent, a summit-level Salesforce consulting and implementation partner and solutions provider, and I am Jeff Stormer, your host as always. In this episode, we're talking about new legislation facing MCOs in New York and how it relates to the broader issues of tracking, maintaining, and working with patients' communication preferences. Our guest this week is Cheryl Gibson, Gerent's Senior Director of Health and Life Sciences for Payers. Cheryl has been in the payer industry for 32 years in a range of positions across several different areas. From the federal employee program to local accounts to national, Cheryl has seen it all. And it was during her time at a large national payer where she got incredible experience in Salesforce, building a roadmap and solution that served the needs of her team in the short term and well into the future. She has an incredible passion for process improvement and for helping payers put the infrastructure in place to best serve their patients' needs. We begin our conversation by breaking down at a high level exactly what this legislation is and how it impacts New York MCOs at a high level.
So the essence of the new legislation is that Medicaid managed care organizations, and that's a mouthful. So Jeff, for today's purpose, we'll call them MCOs, but those that are certified under New York State public health law must have a process by which to obtain and maintain an enrollee's preferences for receiving benefit and medical necessity determination notices electronically, which I know is a mouthful. This guidance includes any and all notifications required for things like coverage determination, complaints, grievances, service authorizations, adverse determinations, or really appeal processes. And it not only impacts MCOs, there are companies, management contractors who work with MCOs. And if they're helping them on their behalf to notify enrollees of benefit or medical necessity determinations, they also will be impacted by this legislation.
Now, before we go any further, in the interest of breaking down our buzzwords, can you talk a little bit about what communication preferences means in this context?
Absolutely. So when a lot of people think of communication preferences, they may be referring to purely, I want information sent to me electronically or versus the mail, right? But this preference can also include alternative methods to accommodate a disability, such as information may have to be made available in Braille or a language need. Communication preferences can also be things like pronouns and, ways that people feel comfortable being communicated with. And so really their customer experience can be severely dampened if they feel that they've provided their communication preferences to their payer or MCO, and then they don't see that the payer is communicating with them in that manner. And they also may feel that if it's a lot of work to maintain this preference, it's an exercise in futility.
And those are pretty serious considerations, right? Like, to your point, I might hear communication preferences and think, I'd rather you text me, but it's fine. But the reality is, like, if I am working with a payer and I constantly have to reassert my pronouns, my identity, my name, that is a pretty dehumanized and dehumanizing healthcare experience. And going even further, if I require that information is sent to me in Braille so that I can read it or in an audio format and I'm not getting it, then the reality is, like, I might just not be able to get the care that I need. And in both cases, that vastly impacts one's ability to get that care, to build those long-term relationships with a payer. And that means it's more difficult to get the care that you need when you really need it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Jeff, 100%. And I think you touched on something really critical, which is that human experience. And so many times over the years, people have felt that their health insurance carrier, it's a very sterile relationship and it is not really a partnership. And they feel like they're a number, in a sea of other members. And this is just one example of a situation where you can personalize that experience, where the member feels like they're being heard, that they're being communicated with appropriately, and then they're going to have a stronger relationship with their health insurance carrier. Absolutely.
Now, hearing Cheryl break all of this down, you get a pretty clear picture of why this is a pressing, urgent thing for MCOs in New York to put in place, even beyond the basic realities of it's the law and its compliance. But as you listen to Cheryl break down what is required for MCOs to maintain that compliance, you start to see that this is a lot more complicated than just hitting yes on a form or turning on a light switch, and you really start to understand that MCOs, without the digital infrastructure in place to manage all of this, are going to be in a really tough spot when it comes to implementing all of these changes, doing it in a short time frame, and maintaining them over time. Let's throw it back to Cheryl to break down exactly what the legislation is asking for.
While we won't go through the litany of everything within the law today, we'll just give you some highlights. So to comply, MCOs will need to follow guidelines in the area of things like enrollee notification standards, the processes to obtain and also for enrollees to change their communication preferences, electronic notification requirements, access and record keeping, and finally, the big one, implementation. So let's take a moment and let me unpack this information for you a little bit as it relates to enrollee notification standards. So to comply, MCOs will need to allow their enrollees to select their preferred method of notification and really allow them to make changes at any time. And if the enrollee chooses no preferred method, that's okay. That MCO can just default to a non-electronic means. It is not mandated for the enrollee to select an electronic method. And of course, the law stipulates that the MCO, they can't retaliate or discriminate or really treat those enrollees any differently because of the methods that they chose. And if an enrollee does select an electronic method of notification, the MCO shall provide that information in what is deemed a readily accessible manner of which the enrollee can retain and then print that notification. So the enrollee may also request at any time that that electronic notification be sent in paper form through regular mail, or if they have a disability or language need, there should be an alternative format available for them. And then lastly, those within the healthcare industry realize that members can have what's called authorized representatives that really help support that particular individual when it comes to the health insurance, and they can be chosen by the enrollee and have the same choices that we're talking about today. But Jeff, the largest lift of this legislation is really surrounding the requirements for MCOs to have a process by which they can obtain and maintain an enrollee's preferences for receiving notifications. And as I said before, we won't go through every detail of this portion of the regulation, but in essence, the process must include, at a minimum, written notification of the option to receive phone and written notifications electronically, and that does need to occur within about 14 days of the effective date of their enrollment. The annual notification of their right to choose and confirmation of what election they chose are also required elements of the process. And efforts must be taken to instruct enrollees on how to access notifications. They have to provide a process by which the enrollee can change preferences. All that has to be done systematically, being able to maintain this information. The electronic noticing formats also have to be readily accessible, and they have to meet HIPAA and New York State confidentiality requirements. And also, the MCO's process must include the ability to present records related to the enrollee's preferred method to the New York Department of Health upon request. The electronic notification options and the notification standards have to be in a place where anyone can access it, which really would be a public-facing location on the MCO website. That is a mouthful right there, but there's a couple more that we have to worry about. The guidelines surrounding access and record-keeping requirements indicate that when a payer or an MCO uses a web-based portal for their electronic notification, the enrollee has to be made aware that there was something sent to them on their account. Now, down to implementation, which you're probably wondering, Jeff, what does it take to implement and how quickly do they have to do it? Well, MCOs must submit their updated policies and procedures to the New York Department of Health, and that has to be reviewed prior to implementation. Once they receive approval, they only have 90 days to implement.
Hearing all of that, I can understand the impulse if you are an MCO from outside of New York to go, well, thank goodness that's not me. After all, that is a lot of work. It needs to be done in a very short time frame. And for many MCOs, it's something they simply don't have the technology to support at this moment. But as Cheryl explains here, even if this doesn't apply to you right now, this is still something you should be paying pretty close attention to. Let's throw it back over to Cheryl for the reasons why.
So many times I think we've seen that, state-specific legislation coming out of New York or California, for example, can find their way into other jurisdictions. And sometimes, things like this are just the right thing to do, whether you're being required to do it legally or not. And I kind of look at this in one of those situations. So the intention behind the legislation is definitely justified for everything we just mentioned, Jeff, and really impacts the member experience in a positive way. So I do think that carriers that are listening to us today and understand this legislation, this is something that if they haven't prepared their system to be able to accommodate, really, should be looking in this direction.
And so as we start to talk about achieving compliance, right? Like what goes into putting this solution in place to meaningfully manage communication preferences, talk to me about some of the specific challenges that MCOs, whether they're in New York or otherwise, are going to be facing. What's going to go into that process? What do MCOs need to be aware of before they start putting solutions in place?
Right. So you definitely hit on the first one, Jeff, which Given that the guidance was effective October 1 and requires implementation within 90 days of approved documentation, that alone is concerning for payers because given the technical challenges that may be present, along with insufficient information on their enrollee population, can be critical. And let me just give you an example. So MCOs may not even have email addresses for all of their population, thereby making electronic means, if you were trying to send an email, difficult to near impossible. The second challenge is that payers may not have a web-based member portal allowing for more effective means of electronic notification to their enrollees. And of course, many payers have disparate systems that do not speak to one another. I think we all know that the healthcare industry is behind, and a lot of them have homegrown systems, and this alone can be a significant challenge. So the capturing of the electronic consent, along with ongoing maintenance of this information, could present challenges in communicating to other systems or even their fulfillment vendors. Many payers use fulfillment vendors to mail communications to their enrollees, and there has to be an effective way to communicate a change in communication preference to these external parties.
So, in your experience, what is the difference between a digitalized business, an MCO that has digital tools such as Salesforce in place to manage their workflows, and an organization that is either building their tools from scratch or has just never looked into digitalization before, in terms of how they can achieve compliance in this specific case, and more broadly when legislation comes through to kind of throw a wrench into the works, so to speak?
We'll start with the ones that are not prepared. As we've talked about, healthcare organizations are historically behind the technology curve. I don't think we're saying anything that any of our listeners will dispute in that way. But really, because of this, MCOs and payers do not have the ability to be nimble when sudden changes occur. So, what typically happens are short term solutions are built to meet that immediate implementation guidelines because obviously if something is a legal requirement, folks have to comply. So folks will put together an immediate solution, but only to produce technical debt later on and inefficient workflows internally. So I call it putting something together with paper clips and Band-Aids, a non-technical way, but that is a lot of time what happens when these legislation items come to play. Now, in contrast to that, an MCO and payer that has a strong digital footprint, they'll be able to quickly adhere to this upcoming legislation and really by augmenting their current automated workflow and any integrations that they already have in place, they'll just be updating that, with this information. So they will be in a much better place and much more nimble to address things as they come in play.
And thinking about that rubber band, paperclip, tape solution, what happens next time, right? This is not the last time that legislation is going to come through and change the way that your MCO does business. So what happens next time that something comes through, right? Are you just going to build another paperclip, Band-Aid, and tape solution? And pretty soon, how much of your organization is held together with rubber bands and tape? And that's not a stable foundation to work off of. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And unfortunately, Jeff, we see that a lot, even with very, very large payers. What happens is isolated solutions are created, again, to meet the need at the time without a longer, more infrastructure roadmap that would help basically lay a good foundation that you can build upon. And so what ends up happening is years over years, they have a lot of different disparate processes that don't speak to one another. They have systems that are not integrated. And you just end up coming into a really bad situation. And every time new legislation comes out, then you're building a new solution. So it really does. At the end, it costs a lot more money for that particular payer, and again leads to inefficiencies.
And the thing that I keep coming back to hearing you speak is that when you have these rubber band and tape solutions and they're all individual ad hoc solutions to address a single thing, is that there's no communication between them. And what you're doing is creating gaps that things are going to fall into. And in this context, especially, that's people and their healthcare. And, thinking about that from a patient perspective, that's heartbreaking, right?
That's absolutely correct. Because the one thing that this can lead to is that if you have a lot of isolated systems that aren't speaking to one another, things like communication preferences, for example, customer service may be speaking to a particular member on the phone, and that member provide updated information, which is then captured. But then if that information is not shared with other sources or other databases where that communication preference is handled, then it could possibly be overwritten. So you may have a database of information that is not kept current, and in which current information is being overwritten by older information. So just not a good situation. And then when you're speaking with a member, you may be speaking to something that is historically incorrect, which does not, improve the customer experience.
At this point, you might be thinking to yourself that you want to make this happen within your organization, right? Whether you're an MCO in New York, whether you want to be proactive in the face of legislation that might be coming later, or you just feel like it's the right thing to do, you might be thinking, how do I make this happen? And if I'm an MCO in New York, how do I make this happen fast? Well, as Cheryl explains here, the answer in many cases is to invest in digital tools that can automate that workload and easily collect, manage, and share key data such as communication preferences between different teams. Let's throw it back over to Cheryl.
So one of the ways to do that is to look at a CRM such as Salesforce. Now, obviously, this is one drop in the bucket of a further ecosystem, but particularly Salesforce, their health cloud, was built for the sole purpose of healthcare organizations, and it continues to provide critical functionality to support just that healthcare industry. And beyond the capturing of things like communication preferences, both MCOs and payers alike can utilize Health Cloud to represent what's called a single pane of glass for their customer service team. And I know, this term is fairly widely known, but for those of you that haven't heard it, really the term single pane of glass speaks to the ability to view everything about a member in one place. And it is really only then in which you can deliver personalized service to your members and enrollees.
Now, digging a little deeper, can you talk to me about a few of the specific things that Health Cloud brings to the table that can allow MCOs to really implement these changes and maintain compliance and use the data that they collect to make a better experience for their members from beginning to end?
So really, we talked a little bit about Health Cloud, and just to give you some historical inference there, since 2015, really Salesforce Health Cloud has provided a digital framework, and it does centralize data, facilitates data analytics, and really ensures that all of its stakeholders have access to the information they need when they need it. And so utilizing Health Cloud as what we've talked about, the single pane of glass for members, along with, creating workflows and integrations, this really empowers the payers and MCOs to have the flexibility needed to address any legislation as it comes. And communication preferences, the example we're talking about today, can easily be maintained, updated, and transmitted as necessary to downstream partners and other systems.
And as we're talking about this, and especially as we're talking about MCOs kind of implementing these digital tools from the ground up, talk to me about what you see as the role of a qualified technology partner such as Gerent in helping build that solution and helping MCOs really get the most out of the technology they're investing in, both now and in the event of future legislation changes down the road.
As a payer, if I put my payer hat back on, it's really important to work with a partner that understands your industry, understands what Salesforce can deliver, and really how Salesforce can deliver an amazing solution for you as an organization. And at Gerent, we deliver comprehensive healthcare management systems, really that leverage best practice processes, big data, and innovative technology. And of course, the importance from a healthcare perspective is ensuring security and compliance with all the health data regulation requirements. So obviously that is key. And our team alone has completed over 1,000 Salesforce implementations, accrued over 1,000 collective years of Salesforce experience, and we hold over 650 Salesforce certifications. we want to be not a vendor, but really a partner, right, with MCOs and payers, because it is important to understand and navigate through the complexity of the healthcare industry in order to implement solutions that will remain agile and nimble. Because as we talked about, that those two terms probably are the most critical in trying to navigate all of the different legislation that is impacting this particular industry.
It's easy to understand why, if you're an MCO in New York, you need to pay attention to this legislation. After all, it is the law and you do need to comply with that. But even for MCOs outside of the state, this is such an important issue to take notice of. After all, like Cheryl said, this is fundamentally about treating people with respect and meeting people where they are. Fail to do that. If you fail to give people what they need or see them as people, or you end up making them feel like a cog in a system, well, they're not going to want to work with you for very long. But the payers that put those digital tools in place, the ones that help humanize the experience and connect with people on a direct, personal level, well, those are the payers that are going to form long-term relationships with customers and deliver a better healthcare experience from the beginning to end. This has been Transformation at Work. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Cheryl Gibson for your incredible contributions and for breaking down this complex issue for us. Transformation at Work is, as always, produced by Gerent in collaboration with Salesforce. I am Jeff Stormer, your host and producer. If you enjoyed the show, consider leaving us a nice 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify, or head to gerent.com to sign up for email updates when we release new episodes. Until next time, thank you again for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.